Hello and welcome to everyone. I understand that this is both a live class and we are also recording this for the purposes of training. We're with Guilford EMS. We're in the County Commissioner's Room in Guilford County. Many thanks to the staff in the Commissioner's Office for helping us today and all the members of the Guilford EMS who helped arrange this training session. What we're going to focus on today is training on medical documentation and how that affects being a witness in the courtroom. So we're going to combine a little bit of lecture and presentation with also live demonstrations of witnesses on the witness stand. We're going to just do little snippets here, so bear with us. But this is not only for today, but hopefully this will also be for the future, for training of EMS personnel, paramedics, both here in Guilford County and possibly beyond. So thank you for being with us today to the entire group. So first of all, I want to thank the EMS, particularly Guilford EMS. You all are public servants. You serve us every day, and we appreciate what you do for our community in keeping us safe. The EMS has just been critically helpful to all of us, particularly during these last few years, and want you to know that we appreciate that. I have frequently spoken to EMS groups and to medical groups on risk management issues. And when we're dealing with risk management, that's avoiding lawsuits. And in avoiding lawsuits, one of the most important things is the medical documentation in a case. And in fact, the medical documentation affects probably 80% of the outcomes in all cases. So medical records are just vitally important. We have a PowerPoint. I'm going to go through some of that. I'm going to go through it slowly for you, but that's not the focus of the presentation. The focus is going to be actually the live examination of the witnesses. I keep looking down at them instead of at the camera because I have all my witnesses here and present, and I want to have them warmed up and ready, both for the direct examination, and there's a couple of you that I'm very excited to do a cross-examination on. So that'll be fun as we go through. So documentation matters, and it matters both for clinical and operational purposes. Clinical purposes is actually the treatment of the patient themselves, not only by you, but the successors in the line of care for the patient. We all know that. Documentation is important from a regulatory and compliance point of view. Your records are reviewed to make sure that you comply. You have courses on compliance, and we've been through all that. And then finally, legal protection, both in case you are a defendant in the case, but far more likely you being a witness in a case. And so lawsuits themselves, the big worry is usually medical malpractice, which EMS providers fall under our medical malpractice statutes, but lawsuits themselves are actually fairly uncommon. In North Carolina, we have very good immunity statutes that help protect you, and likewise, the burden of proof in emergency medicine is at a higher standard. It's at the clear and convincing standard, which is a higher hurdle in court, which makes those cases relatively rare. However, many times you're going to be called in cases as a witness. The witness can be in a variety of different type of cases. It can be in a criminal case, which can be a DWI, drug possession, assault, those sort of things. It can be in a civil case where you're simply a fact witness, not somebody in the case who's a defendant, but you're simply a fact witness laying the groundwork. Many times that's very important because the EMS personnel are the first ones on the scene, and they're able to lay the groundwork and provide that background for any type of case. real quickly, one of the things that EMS personnel and paramedics are interested in is what type of cases make me most vulnerable. And interestingly, the vast majority, and when we teach paramedic classes, we have Captain Cross here who teaches at the Paramedic Academy, is when we teach at the paramedic classes, we always go through a drill, and it's a little bit of a trick question. Far and away, the largest number of types of cases in which EMS might be involved from a liability point of view is a motor vehicle accident. So that's far and away the highest volume of cases. And then as far as treatment, issues regarding refusals and consent, issues regarding abandonment and cancellation of calls, improper restraints, many times those are drops or falls of patients, and lastly, DNR, do not resuscitate orders. So those are the orders with the most frequency. And on each of those topics, we could probably do a full seminar on those. So one of the best defenses that we always talk about at the Paramedic Academy is to make sure you use proper communication and that you're nice to people. With medical records documentation, one of the most important things is to make sure that your spelling and your written communication is good. I'll share with you one real quick example of a piece of an electronic medical record from a case I was involved with. And you can see in this record, when you look at it, that this is actually correct. The paramedic put X-year-old, not the person's age, so we don't know whether they're young, old, what they are. Run-on sentences, you run down to the bottom scene, the officers on the scene left patient in their, as in over their care, not their possessive care. Well, what you have is you have bad grammar, you have run-on sentences, you have improper punctuation, and when you put that in a courtroom, that looks bad. That looks bad for all parties involved, and it affects your credibility. So that's very, very important. So let's jump back to the legal system. And in the legal system, the first type of case you have is a civil case. The civil cases are typically going to be negligent cases. That's one party against another party. We'll have a demonstration of that coming. We then have criminal cases. Criminal cases tend to be the most frequent time that EMS personnel and paramedics actually testify in court. We'll have examples of those. And then we have administrative cases in hearings. For you, administrative can cover compliance issues, regulatory issues, billing issues, and accounting issues with regard to your services. Recently, and it is very impressive, I went back and looked at some of the trial from the George Floyd case. And the paramedics were very, very instrumental in the testimony in that case. And if you all will recall, you not only had two of the treating paramedics testify in that trial, you also had an off-duty paramedic as a witness. And she also testified in the trial. And that was a reminder for me that the vast majority of the time that you end up testifying in a case, the case isn't against you, you're a witness in the case by virtue of your position. And to make these, to make this record keeping and documentation important to you, I want to go through with you how a lawsuit starts. And the reason is because when you write your records, what you want your records to do is tell the story of the case. As I sometimes say, that paints the picture that you're going to look back at a future point in time. What you don't know, and what is hard to realize when you're in the heat of the moment and you're writing those records, is those records may be reviewed at some point way into the future. For a criminal case, we have speedy trial statutes and that sort of thing, so it's usually not too terribly remote. Usually within the next 6 months to 12 months, you'll be testifying in that sort of case. But a very quick rundown, in a civil case, the statute of limitations is 3 years, which means there's 3 years before the lawsuit actually gets filed. After that, there's the pleadings in the case, and the responsive pleadings can take another 6 months in the case. Cases then go to mediation, various court hearings. If there's a ruling in the case that is consequential and determinative, that case could go up onto appeal. That means it would go to the Court of Appeals for another year to year and a half. That could get appealed again to the Supreme Court another year, a year and a half. During this COVID period of time, our courts are backed up. You add in a civil case another 6 months to a year to that. The Supreme Court then sends it way back down to trial. We recently had a case, went to the Court of Appeals, the Supreme Court, back down, back to the appellate court, and back down before it was resolved, more than 10 years from the date of the occurrence. That is the importance of your records and documentation from a liability point of view, is you need to go back and look at records from a situation that happened a long time ago, and you've had hundreds or potentially thousands of events that have happened in between, and there's no way you can remember that unless your record keeping is very, very good. So, are we ready for the first scenario? So let me set the stage here. Our first case that we have is a DWI case. And in that DWI case, what we're going to do is we're going to call an EMS provider who was on the scene to help me as the prosecutor prosecute the person that's charged with DWI. So I am the prosecutor, and is Officer Carrie Cross in the room, please? Paramedic Cross, would you come up and take the witness stand that we have set up on the other side of the courtroom? And what we would do is we would call Paramedic Carrie Cross to the stand. Paramedic Cross, who is over here, would come to the stand. He would stand up. He would be sworn in. He would take his seat. And then I would say, Paramedic Cross, could you please introduce yourself to the court and to this good-looking jury by name and by position?
My name is Kerry Cross. I'm a paramedic with Guilford County Emergency Services. I've been with EMS since May of 1992.
Since May of 1992?
Yes, sir.
So 30 years you've been with EMS?
Just about, yes, sir.
Yeah, can you tell us what your training was? Well, first let's go through your educational background. What is your educational background?
So my particular background, I had a 2-year associate's degree in emergency medical science. Then I came to Guilford County, and with there we receive monthly continuing education to continue to build off of your initial education.
So you slow down just a little bit. You came to Guilford County. Did you come to Guilford County as a paramedic?
I came to Guilford County as a graduate of an associate's degree, and then I had to work through the process of EMT up to a paramedic level.
Can you very quickly explain what that process is?
So when you first come to an organization, you typically work as a EMT, which is kind of a basic field provider.
That's an emergency medical technician.
Yes, sir.
Does that mean you work with an ambulance and the paramedic team?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so you were first an EMT, and then?
And then you progress through training and evaluations. And at the time I came in, it was called an EMT intermediate level. And then you work through up to a paramedic, which typically takes roughly a year to accomplish.
So is that a combination of experience and continuing education during that period of time?
Yes, sir.
And did you successfully complete that and become a paramedic with the Greensboro EMS?
Yes, sir, with Guilford County Emergency Medical Services. Yes.
And what year was that?
It was probably around mid-93.
Okay. So since 1993, you have been an EMS personnel and a paramedic in Guilford County.
Yes, sir.
And can you tell us about your experience as a paramedic? What have you done with the department over the years?
So over the years, I continued on to work as a advanced field provider as a paramedic. Several years later, I became a field training officer, or what we call a lieutenant. I worked as a lieutenant for about a year, and then I progressed to a field supervisor, captain. And then, I guess 7 years ago, I came into the office as a training supervisor.
So, and as a training supervisor, you supervise other paramedics in the department.
Yes, sir. And you start doing that as a captain or a field supervisor.
And as part of that responsibility, do you also put on monthly training sessions for other paramedics and EMS personnel?
Yes, sir. As a training supervisor, we provide not only continuing education, but also initial education for a lot of our providers.
And for the last number of years, have you also run the Paramedic Academy for Guilford Emergency Services?
I'm part of a team that runs that. So we have a training team with a training manager that we provide all the training for EMS.
So what I'm doing here is what's called qualifying the witness. And so I might go through a little bit more of his background training and experience, but for the purposes of this, we'll move on. At this point, I would tender Paramedic Cross to the court as an expert witness in the field of EMS and as a paramedic. So we tender you to the court. There's no objection. You're accepted. Can you tell, in part of the qualification, I would go through the shifts that they work, the 12 on, the 12 off, those sort of things, so that what I'm trying to do is give a baseline of credibility for Captain Cross so that he becomes more believable to the jury and to the court, and of course shows his credibility in his experience. Officer Cross, were you called to an event in September of 2018 regarding the defendant in this case?
Yes, sir.
And being called to that, did you fill out a patient medical report?
Yes, sir.
And if I may approach the witness, Your Honor, I want to show Captain Cross what we've marked is exhibit number 1. Captain Cross, I see you brought a copy of records with you. Can you quickly look and see if our exhibit 1 is the same as the records that you brought with you?
Yes, sir. It appears to be.
So why were you called to this scene?
So this came out as a motor vehicle accident, and we were one of 2 ambulances that responded to this scene.
And it was just part of a regular call of duty for you?
Yes, sir.
And when you got to the scene, where did you find the defendant?
So I received the defendant from another unit, another ambulance personnel that were already there. They had established the initial contact with him and began treatment. So I received basically him from that crew and a report from them.
And when you received him from that crew, did you note his injuries and his condition?
Yes, sir.
So for purposes of this, we're not going to go through all of his injuries, but can you tell us what your secondary impression was was when you showed up on the scene?
My secondary impression was that he had several injuries. He was combative, a little disoriented, and confused with us.
Did he cooperate with you?
He did not.
And on the first page of exhibit number 1, there's an entry on the record form for alcohol/drugs. Is that a standard part of your medical record form?
Yes, sir.
And in that blank, what did you put?
Let me see exactly.
And if I can assist the witness a little, please.
Uncooperative, and then for the alcohol and drugs, I put patient admits to alcohol use.
So the defendant, admitted to you using alcohol.
Yes, sir.
And going over on page number 2 of the report, again, was he cooperative with you?
No, he was not.
Flip to page 3 of your report, paramedic Cross. Under the neurological assessment, what findings did you make?
So under neurological, put mild slurring of speech. There was a strong odor of ETOH about the patient and in the vehicle.
What is ETOH?
That is alcohol.
That's like alcohol that you would drink?
Drinking alcohol,
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
And was his slurring of his speech consistent with alcohol use?
Yes, sir, it was.
And you noted that both under the comments and under the findings that he had slurred speech.
Yes, sir.
What does oriented times 3 mean?
So we use basically a alert. They're conscious, alert, and oriented to basically person, place, and some people will add time into it. So sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's 4.
Okay, and was he oriented times 3?
He was alert to. He was confused to. He was combative. He was confused to. Well, I'm sorry. Person oriented, place oriented.
And so that's oriented times 2?
Yes, sir.
Well, why wasn't he oriented times 3?
He was confused to time.
And confused to time, in your experience, is that consistent with alcohol use?
Yes, sir, it could be.
Flipping over to the next page of your report, did he tell you anything about alcohol use?
Yes, sir. I had in my narrative that he did.
And specifically, what did he tell you in your narrative? By the way, on this narrative, you completed this report within an hour after the event.
I couldn't say exactly when, but typically within an hour or a couple hours, we will complete this, depending on how busy the service gets.
So it was within the same relevant period of time?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so what did he tell you?
So what I have in quotation marks in my narrative is that I'm, a 4-letter word, up man. I've been drinking at the bar, the one downstairs. I can't remember where it was, though. And then he says, shit, man.
So he told you that he was, quote, effed up.
Yes, sir.
Although he used the actual word.
Yes, sir.
And you put that in quotation marks in your report.
Yes, sir.
What's the significance of the quotation marks in your report?
But just to say that he said it, and that's not from me, and that's not my opinion.
Is that verbatim from him?
Yes, sir.
And the speech with which he told you that with, how was his speech?
I documented that his speech was slurred.
Paramedic Cross, based on your treatment, your examination, your interaction, and the statements made to you by the defendant, do you have a professional opinion to a reasonable degree of certainty and satisfactory to yourself as to whether or not the defendant was impaired at the time of this incident?
I do feel, based off of experience, based off of training, education, statements that he made that there was impairment.
And let me ask you another question, and this one's going to seem a little bit silly, but we're anticipating the defense to possibly claim that this was not the driver of the vehicle.
Yes.
Based on what's in your report, including having to cut him out of the driver's side seatbelt, do you have an opinion, a professional opinion, satisfactory to yourself and to a reasonable degree of certainty as to whether or not this defendant was driving the vehicle at the time you had an opinion he was impaired?
So really all I can say is where we where he was physically located in the vehicle, which was in the driver's seat with the seatbelt in place, and he was basically hanging from the seatbelt.
And is your experience, is that consistent with being the driver of the vehicle?
He was found in the driver's seat.
And were there any other occupants of that vehicle on the scene?
No, sir.
And with an accident this significant, if there was another occupant, would you expect him to be there?
You would think so, yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Cross. Please answer any questions the defense lawyer has to ask of you.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to switch hats, which is an unusual thing to do, and I get to cross-examine Captain Cross regarding this same incident. Now, Captain Cross, when you arrived on the scene, this was a serious accident, wasn't it?
Yes, sir.
A rollover accident is serious.
Yes, sir.
And the defendant, he had injuries over many different parts of his body, correct?
Yes, sir.
His arms,
Yes, sir.
his legs,
Yes, sir.
his neck,
Yes, sir.
all the way up. He would have had to have hit his head in an accident like this, correct?
The evidence shows he probably did.
He probably did. And can head trauma, can that cause an altered mental status?
Yes, sir.
Can that cause slurring of speech?
Yes, sir.
Can that cause you to be uncooperative?
Yes, sir.
Could that cause you to want to take off a cervical collar?
Yes, sir.
Can it cause anxiety?
Yes, sir.
Can it cause your blood pressure to be higher?
Potentially, yes, sir.
Can it cause your heart rate to be higher?
Yes, sir.
And in fact, you found that right after the accident, he had a high blood pressure and a high heart rate.
Yes, sir.
Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So all that would be consistent with head trauma, correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, you didn't find any evidence of any alcoholic beverages in the car.
No, sir.
You have no idea when he could or might have consumed any alcohol beverages.
Correct.
From a time point of view.
Yes, sir.
Are you familiar with the epidemiology of alcohol and how impairment works?
No, sir.
So you don't know whether any impairment that he might have had earlier in the evening was going up or going down at the time of the incident.
Correct.
So you can't give an opinion on that.
Right.
Do you have any training in sobriety evaluation?
No, sir, do not.
Do you have any training in field sobriety tests?
No, sir, do
Are
not.
you familiar with the nystagmus test?
I know what nystagmus is, yes, sir.
And how long would that take to give?
What do you mean?
To give the nystagmus test, it wouldn't take longer than what, 10 seconds?
Yeah.
Yeah, but you didn't bother to do that, did you?
No, sir.
No, and that's not in your records either.
Right, correct.
So everything that you've testified to is perfectly consistent with a head injury.
Yes, sir.
You have no physical evidence of any drinking of alcohol.
Just the odors and the fact that he just admitted to drinking. That's it, though.
Now, you did your initial entries in this medical chart at 2:12, correct?
The entry into the chart.
Your first evaluation of symptoms.
Yeah, I believe it was 217.
Okay, and at 2:29, you had that his mental status was improving. Is that correct?
Yes.
And isn't mental status improving over a 12 to 17 minute period of time consistent with getting your wits together after head trauma?
It potentially could be.
And let's go back to the blood pressure and heart rate.
Okay.
Blood pressure goes up with high anxiety in a traumatic situation, correct?
Yes, sir.
And it came down. That would be consistent with trauma and a head injury, wouldn't it?
Potentially, yes, sir.
He also had an elevated heart rate right after the incident, correct?
Yes, sir.
And an elevated heart rate could be consistent with a head injury and trauma.
Potentially, yes, sir.
And that also came down after the anxiety and the immediate trauma if the incident was over. Isn't that correct?
After some time, yes, sir.
Yeah. In improving medical status from an impairment from alcohol, that doesn't happen over 12 to 17 minutes, does it?
It depends on what
Well,
time,
it depends. Of course, you don't have any training in alcohol impairment and testing or sobriety testing, correct?
Yes, sir.
So you don't know that?
You're correct, sir.
Okay, thank you. Do you by chance know, did he have any other medical conditions?
Of what? I'm sorry.
Did the defendant have any other medical conditions?
I did not note any.
No, you didn't note that in your record.
Right.
How about medications? That'd be important to know. Did you note that in your record?
I did not have that. No,
I have no more questions for this witness, Your Honor.
Thank you.
So that was an example. Obviously, it's a little bit dramatic. The full testimony would probably take longer than that. We would probably go through his qualifications, training, and experience a little bit more. He's a highly qualified witness, and he's the type of witness that you would want to have in a case. For cross-examination, that's just doing my job. I think it's probably pretty obvious that this defendant was impaired. However, in a criminal case, it's got to be proved beyond a reasonable doubt, and my job is to put doubt into the case, and I was going to do that through head injury and trying to pick out some inconsistencies in Captain Cross's records. So that's our scenario number one. You all ready for scenario 2 and 3? So let's go back to the documentation. And the documentation, what you want to make sure that you do in all of your documentation is that it's factual and accurate, complete, and clear. What you want to do through your records is paint a story so that when somebody goes back and looks at it, that they then know what happened and that it's accurate, both for follow-up medical treatment, but particularly if you have to go into the courtroom. I showed you that timeline. In a criminal case, maybe 6 to 12 months later. A civil case, it could be 3 to 10 years later, and you're not going to remember every incident. One of the things that Captain Cross did is discuss the policy on doing the records. You always want to do the records in a timely, contemporaneous manner as soon as possible thereafter, ideally before the next call. That isn't always possible, but that would be ideal. I know that different departments have different policies between 24 and 72 hours of finalizing records and getting them submitted. Want to go through real quickly some common pitfalls, some of which I pointed out in my cross-examination. I'm going to go through this real quickly because we got another witness waiting in the courtroom, and we want to make sure that we get to that witness. So common pitfalls. Pitfalls that we go through, and I'm going to go through these very quickly, is omissions, personal opinions. In your position, what you want to do is be factual. And you want the facts to be as specific as possible. And remember, in the chain of medical treatment, that specific information can be very, very important to the next provider in the chain. It's also very, very important to your billing and coding department for reimbursements, which is obviously very, very significant for the EMS personnel. You want to avoid late charting. Late charting both is a delay in time in doing your chart or going back and adding to it later. Different electronic systems now have different ways that you can go back and add on to a report. Those are always areas for attack when they're late. The one thing that I always get when I discuss with doctors, but paramedics also, is, oh, that information is on the drop-down screen. Well, you know what the most ignored portion of an electronic medical record is, and this is across all formats, it's skipping over a drop-down screen or checking and filling in a box. So those are very, very important for you. You've done it many, many times, and it may seem to get very, very routine, but for that particular case, it can be very, very important. I have a whole stack of old EMS records with improper abbreviations. Always use proper abbreviations. It makes you look professional. It also helps the next provider. Correction of errors happens differently in different types of programs. Incorrect spelling, like you can see here, excellence. You need to have proper spelling. I've recommended this to others, to MDs and others in the medical field. If you don't have good grammar and good spelling, because a lot of the programs don't have spell check built in, if you don't have that, have somebody like I do review your things before you hit the file button to make sure it's spelled correctly. And or I've also recommended to professionals go back to a community college and take a basic course in grammar and English. It could prove to be very, very helpful to you if you need that. All these reports that we had today are signed. Make sure they're signed, properly signed. Make sure they're signed by the person that actually did it. We've had cases over the years where it's signed by somebody else because they get busy. That is a serious, serious problem in the event you're ever called to testify, either as a defendant or as a witness in the case. Documenting consents and refusals, very, very important, and documenting any cancellations or in abandonment. And again, what you want to do is completely paint that picture. So is our next witness ready? And if so, we're going to go to scenario number 2, which is a negligence case. So if our next witness could take the stand, please. So this is a negligence case where I am the attorney representing the patient, and the patient ended up with either a severe medical condition as a result of this incident and or a death afterwards. And in this one, what I'm doing is I am cross-examining again our paramedic witness, and it's Chris Wilson. So paramedic Wilson, we are now going to talk to you. Your Honor, may I approach the witness and show paramedic Wilson exhibit number 2? Paramedic Wilson, I see you brought records with you. Can you look at that exhibit and tell me, is that the same as the report that you did?
Does appear to be.
It appears to be. Does that mean you're sure or not sure?
Yes, sir.
You're sure about that, huh?
Yes, sir.
Are you always sure?
Yes, sir.
Oh, you are. Is the information in your records always sure? Yeah, well,
to the best of my ability.
Let's go on. So what was the, you came to this, this response as a member of the EMS team, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you put on your report, can you tell me, now I can't pronounce the names as well as you can, is pronounce that word for me. You know which one I'm looking at?
Epistaxis.
Epistaxis. And tell the members of the jury, what is an epistaxis?
A nosebleed.
It's a bloody nose. Did you write bloody nose anywhere in here?
No, sir.
No, you just put that condition. So he had a bloody nose. Can you tell us whether that was a posterior or anterior bloody nose?
I'm not certain.
Well, what's the important difference between a posterior and anterior bloody nose?
Would determine where the bleed is coming from.
And what does that do with regard to seriousness of the bleed?
It certainly would tell us how serious the bleed was.
So how many arteries run through the nasal cavity?
I have no idea, sir.
You don't know how many, so you got a bloody nose, but you don't know how many arteries go through the nasal cavity.
That's correct.
And if you studied anatomy?
Yes, sir.
But you don't know about bloody noses in the arteries in the nasal.
Not to that level of detail, no, sir.
Did you know there's 5 of them?
No, sir.
You didn't know that.
That's correct.
Do you think that's accurate, or do you think I'm making it up?
I have no idea. I trust
you just don't know, and you don't have any recollection whether this is an anterior or posterior nasal bleed.
That's correct. I do not.
Wouldn't that maybe be important for you?
Certainly.
It would be. Well, we should put it in the records probably. How about blood pressure? What is? Tell us how you would rate a blood pressure of 206 over 110.
I would rate that certainly higher than normal.
Higher than normal?
Yes, sir.
Isn't that extremely high?
It's certainly higher than what we would expect it to be. I don't know whether I would say it's extremely high, but certainly higher than what would be considered normal.
Well, what would that be a symptom of?
What would high blood pressure be a symptom of?
Sure, a blood pressure of 200 over 110.
It could certainly be that the person has high blood pressure or hypertension that is not being treated. It could be a head injury. It could be anxiety. It could be a handful of things.
Did you do anything with regard to that high blood pressure?
I'm sorry, I don't understand your question.
Well, isn't that an extreme hypertension at that level?
It is certainly higher than what I would expect.
And that could be associated with a stroke, potentially?
Yes, sir.
What about his pulse? What was his pulse?
I documented that his pulse was 112.
112. How's that? Is that a high pulse, low pulse?
It would be higher than what we would.
What would normal be?
Normal would be 60 to 80.
60 to 80. So 112. That's significantly higher than 60 or 80, correct?
Yes, sir.
What does the CBG stand for?
It's blood glucose.
And what was his blood glucose?
185.
What's a standard blood glucose range?
60 to 120.
So 60 to 120, so his blood glucose is elevated.
Yes, sir.
And what concern did you show for blood glucose?
I certainly noted that it was higher than what would be considered normal.
So interesting. What position did you find this person in when you came to the scene?
So when I arrived on the scene, there was a supervisor already there, which is a paramedic supervisor on the scene, and the patient was in care of that supervisor. I received the patient from the supervisor.
So I'm not an expert on the way you do records in your EMS department, but it has an anatomic position on the records. What's an anatomic position mean?
Anatomic position would be the position of the patient in which you found them. So standing, sitting, lying on their left side, right side.
So can you explain to us the anatomic position of this person, of the patient?
I do not see that documented.
Look at page 1 in the top right. I understand you did your report, but you're not that familiar with it. Page 1, the top right. What's the anatomic position of this patient?
In my documentation, I noted that the anatomic position was the genitalia.
Genitalia. Could you please demonstrate a person's genitalia position?
No, sir, I would be unable to do that.
Oh, why would you be unable to demonstrate the genitalia position?
If I'm not mistaken, when it asked me anatomic position, that's referring to kind of the primary and secondary impression that I would have. So meaning, where is the complaint? What's the anatomic position on the body of the complaint? Not necessarily how I found the patient.
Right. Oh, but you just said that the way you found him was in the genitalia. Well, let me ask you another question. And I'm sorry you couldn't act that out. That would be entertaining for our group here. Are you aware that you are governed by the rules and regulations in the Federal Register regarding doing your medical reports?
I'm certainly understand that we have regulations and guidelines, but I'm not familiar with in detail.
And what does that say with regard to completeness of your reports?
I would certainly assume that it would say that they need to be complete.
They need to be complete.
Yes, sir.
They need to be thorough. They need to be accurate.
Yes, sir.
Is this accurate?
Does not
Well, let
appear
me
to
ask
be.
you another question. Tell me what his airway was like at the scene.
So I noted that his respiratory rate was 18 in regular in my documentation, and then again, he had a respiratory rate of 20 in regular as well, and I did not note anything concerning about his airway.
So, what level of care was given in transport?
In transport,
What level of service?
appears to be basic level of service.
Basic level of service. Let's go to page 2 on the left, about 2/3 of the way down the page. Level of service.
Yes, sir.
That says advanced life support.
Yes, sir.
Is advanced life support consistent with regular service?
It would not be considered basic level of
And
service.
the patient was unconscious and fainting, correct?
That's how the call was dispatched. Yes, sir.
And so you have a patient that's unconscious and fainting, and he told you didn't need to check the airways?
Yes, sir. The airway was assessed, as I mentioned earlier.
Hey, where was it assessed?
On page 1, under the vital signs,
And what does that vital sign say?
the RR stands for respiratory rate 20 in regular.
So he was breathing. How about his circulation?
His pulse was 112 in regular.
So high pulse. Look at your front page of your report, the top right. What is your first entry?
Under primary impression, I put hemorrhagic shock.
And what's hemorrhagic shock?
It would essentially mean that you are in a state of shock due to loss of blood.
And so he had a loss of blood from the nosebleed that we don't know whether it was posterior or anterior. You don't indicate that he's bleeding anywhere else.
That's correct.
So the loss of blood comes from the nosebleed, but you don't know anything more about that.
Correct.
You didn't investigate further about that
I did not document it.
because your duty to be complete, thorough, and accurate, you certainly would have put all that in there if it had been there.
Yes, sir.
So you didn't document that.
No, sir.
Did you took him to Wesley Long Hospital?
Yes, sir.
When you got to Wesley Long Hospital, did you tell them about the nosebleed?
I can't recall the exact conversation that I had, but I would,
Do you know who you talked to?
one of the ED nurses.
Do you know who you handed him off to?
I do not recall the name.
So you just turned him over and you left the hospital?
No, sir. Generally speaking, when we hand over patients, we give them kind of a full report or a synopsis of what we found and what care we provided for the patients.
Your full report and synopsis, you would put that in your record because you're required to, correct?
Yes, sir.
So you reported he's in the genitalia position when you turned him over to the hospital?
No, sir.
You didn't tell them that.
Um,
Why wouldn't you tell them everything that's important? It's important if you put it in your record.
I'm not certain, sir.
All right, thank you so much. And that is, would you like to offer something, Paramedic Wilson? So, just a little bit of fun with Paramedic Wilson. We're going to have to vote afterwards. We're going to have number 1, number 2, or number 3. Number 3, don't smile too big. So that was interesting. Obviously, the report was not thorough. it was not accurate. In painting that picture that you want to look at, remember, this could have been 3 years after the event. It could have been 10 years after the event. It puts paramedic Wilson and your entire unit in a bad light in this situation. You don't know the answers, you don't know what happened, and your record keeping wasn't very good in this case. Ready to move on? Let's talk about refusals, because this is an area that comes up frequently. And in refusals, you want to make sure that the person refusing has legal capacity and mental capacity, and that they're fully informed. I know that in the paramedic academy, they go through a whole section on the capacity for a refusal. The important thing in the medical records documentation is to make sure that that is fully documented. And this is the law. This is a quote right out of the law. Has a right to refuse any and all medical care, even if that care would have saved their life. There is a right to refuse, but they've got to have capacity to do that. Likewise, and I think refusals, consent, and abandonment, I kind of put them all in the same category. And the abandonment is the termination of care, and you have to have the patient's consent either to terminate care. As you know, by statute, you're required to provide more care if it's needed and if it's life-supporting. And the big areas that you sometimes are going to run into is outside factors that come in. And the big ones that we see a lot are domestic disturbances or law enforcement is involved. So if you're handing a case over to law enforcement, make sure that that is fully documented and who's in charge and who's in control in those situations. So that's going to lead us to our scenario number 3. And so we're going to call our witness to the stand in scenario number 3. And we are going to do this one just like we did scenario number 1, with both the prosecution on a direct exam, and then we're also going to do a cross-examination. So this is a case in which the state is bringing a claim against the parents for child abuse or neglect, and they're going to base it on the information, partially on the information that's in this medical report. So our witness, would you introduce yourself, please, to the court and to the jury?
My name is Rachel Oreo. I am an EMT basic.
Rachel Oreo?
Yes.
Ms. Oreo, thank you for coming court today. Can you tell us how you arrived? Let me first approach you and give you what I've marked as exhibit number 3. I see you brought records with you. Is that a true and accurate copy of what you brought with you?
Yes.
I'll let you refer to your own records with Ms. Oreo?
Yes.
Okay. I keep thinking of the cookie. So
it is like the cookie.
So with Ms. Oreo, I'd go through her background, her training, her experience, just like I did with Captain Cross. In this case, we won't do that because for time purposes, and you've already had a demonstration as to how that works. So, Ms. Oreo, you were called to the scene of this incident, and earlier you described that scene with 2 adults who were unconscious parked in a car. Where were they parked?
They were parked in the Walmart parking lot.
So they're just unconscious in a car in a Walmart parking lot. At what time of day was this?
This was about 2 p.m.
And when you got to the scene, Were you in a position where you could observe the individuals and observe what was in the car?
Yes.
Can you tell the jury in this court what you observed in the car?
When my partner and I arrived on scene, we could see both subjects in the front of the vehicle. They appeared to be sleeping. They had needles in their hands.
And when you say needles in their hands, what type of needles did they have?
We assumed they were drug paraphernalia needles.
So, well, I'm asking for a description of the needle.
Syringes.
They had syringes with them. And what are those type of syringes typically used for in a parking lot of a Walmart?
For what they would be for drugs.
And do you have experience in being called on incidents where drugs were involved?
Yes.
And in addition, both individuals were unconscious?
Yes.
And was there anybody else in the car with them?
There was a child in the back seat.
And did you have to do anything to take care of the child?
The child was screaming, so we approached the back of the vehicle to try to get to the child.
And when you were doing this, can you tell us the level of cooperation between the adults in the car?
The adults were completely unconscious while we were trying to enter the vehicle to access the child.
So, and I'm looking right at your report. So there were two adults unconscious in the car. Is that correct?
Yes.
And your answers have to be out loud for the court because our court report over here is taking a record, and this is important to know. Your answers have to be oral, and it can't pick up head shakes and nods.
Correct.
So have to have yes and no answers. They were unconscious in the car, and they were sleeping with needles in their hands?
Yes, they appeared to be sleeping with needles in their hands.
And did you try to get their attention in any way?
We did knock on the window to get their attention, and they did not respond to our knocks on the windows.
And again, is the not responding to knocks on the windows, is that an indication to you of post-drug use?
Yes.
Is that a consistent sign?
Yes.
Were they cooperative with you?
Upon our initial assessment of them, they were completely unresponsive. So they were.
And once they did come around a little bit, were they cooperative with you?
They denied to give us any kind of information, so I would say that they were uncooperative.
And just to be clear, there were only 3 people in the car.
Correct.
2 individuals.
Correct.
A small child.
Correct.
And was there anybody else looking after the child?
No.
During your time on the scene, did anybody come to the care of the child?
No.
Did anybody else at any point from the time you got to the scene through your entire investigation provide any comfort, support, or care to the child other than your paramedic team?
No.
Thank you very much, Ms. Oreo. We appreciate you being here and supporting our court system. So that's a direct examination of Ms. Oreo, and what we wanted to show is simply that the individuals were probably using drugs. They had dangerous needles with them, and that would be something we would argue later in the case, that there were no other caretakers of any sort for the child, and obviously we'll have other pieces of the puzzle we're going to present in order to present our case for neglect in the and child abuse. So she's also going to be subject to cross-examination, right? So, Ms. Oreo, there's not any difference between a needle that might be used by a diabetic and a needle that might be used by a drug addict. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And you didn't do any investigation onto that issue whatsoever.
Correct.
Well, correct. You would have had to have put it in your report if it had been, right?
Yes,
Yeah, you're required to do complete and accurate and thorough reporting.
correct,
So if that was the case, you would have put it in the in the record.
correct.
So you didn't put in the record any other reason or ask that question regarding diabetes or any other medical condition.
No,
You're not aware of any other medical conditions.
that's correct.
You didn't ask about any other medical conditions.
That is correct.
So did tell us how long the two adults had been sleeping in the car.
Before our arrival, it looks like the call was called in about 4 minutes before we got there. I am not sure on the time for how long they had been in there.
So you don't know how long they've been sleeping.
I do not.
So that's not real thorough. They were just sleeping, but we don't know how long. Tell us about the child in the car. How old was the child?
I do not know the age of the child. I would say about under 10
Oh, under 10. There's
from
a
our
big,
observation.
There's a big difference between under 10. There's a difference between a 2-year-old and an 8-year-old, isn't there?
Correct.
And you said on direct examination that the child was screaming in the back. Where did you say that the child was screaming in the back?
I did not document that in my report.
You didn't put that in your report?
I did not document that in my report, no.
Oh, but you felt that it was important enough for the prosecution to put that the child was screaming, and although this happened a long time ago and it's not in your report, now you're going to tell us the child was screaming?
That is correct.
If that was important at the time, why didn't you put it in the report?
I must have overlooked it.
You don't know how old the child was. You don't know how long they were sleeping. Did you test to see if there were any illegal drugs in the car?
We did not test for illegal drugs, no.
Did you see any illegal drugs?
We did document that there was drug paraphernalia on scene.
Did you transport these individuals to the hospital?
No, they refused transportation.
They refused transport. And of course, in properly doing your job, they refused transport. You had to evaluate their decision-making capacity, correct?
Correct.
What was their decision-making capacity?
Once they became alert and awake, I documented them as.
So you're telling us you cleared the mental capacity of somebody who's passed out in the car from using drugs? How about their medical capacity? You also cleared their medical capacity, correct?
And they denied their medical assessment.
But you cleared them. So we had discussed earlier orientation times 3. You wouldn't have had to have made the determination that these people that you allege are passed out due to drugs are oriented times 3.
Correct.
And so what your testimony today is that people who are oriented times 3, mental, medical, and legal capacity were passed out from using drugs. Is that correct? And that's what you want this jury to believe?
That is correct.
Thank you, Ms. Oreo. No further questions for you. So, again, documenting the refusal. In this case, thank you, Ms. Oreo, you were very good. In this case, interestingly, probably this is an unusual situation. You're not sleeping in the car at 2 in the afternoon. However, we've got them passed out and calling it drug paraphernalia, while at the same time saying that they're oriented to mental, legal, and physical capacity. Those wouldn't seem to go together. All cases are a puzzle piece. In a larger case, I would then argue at the end of the case, this piece doesn't fit, and then take that down the road to the result that we would want in the case. So, scenario number 3. On refusals, I think it's very important that you put the facts in there when they refuse. Just that they cleared mental status and just that they cleared medical status could be flimsy. Add specifics to your narrative report, particularly in a refusal or an abandonment situation, because that's what will be alleged if something negative goes wrong in the future. So we've been through our three scenarios. We've been through the basics of medical records documentation. That is a complete another class and other seminar. We'll want to go through power of attorney and guardianship. This one is a question that comes up frequently with healthcare providers, law enforcement providers, many servants in our community, and quite frankly, it's confusing even for medical providers. And in fact, I meant to cross-examine Captain Cross on this point, and I didn't. And Captain Cross had on his report, there's a space for advanced directives, and the advanced directives is none. Well, you're telling me that the guy that is so effed up, you're here to support a DWI charge, was competent enough to explain to you what advanced directives are, and that he didn't have them? But again, that's another form of paperwork. And these are areas where you have to be very, very careful. So guardianship. A guardian, the big difference between a power of attorney and a guardianship is a guardianship cannot be waived. A power of attorney can be waived. So a guardianship is an order that comes from a court or some other administrative capacity that has the authority to appoint a guardianship. If you are the guardian for somebody, you have the right to make their decisions for them. So guardianship is typically children. Their parents are guardian by act of law. If they're over 18, they'd have to be a guardian by going to court and being appointed guardian. An elderly person, you go to court when they have dementia or they're losing their mental capacity to be their guardian to handle their affairs, or a disabled person. And so in a guardianship situation, if somebody says, I'm the guardian, the standard of care for emergency personnel is make a good faith determination as to whether that is reasonably accurate, okay? So you've got a teenager there, and Officer Wilson comes up and says, I'm the guardian, this is my stepson, this is my son, this is my adopted son. That is reasonably likely that Officer Wilson is the guardian of this underage person because he's with the person, he lives with the person, he's there, he's interested. You can take those circumstances that that's the guardian. Likewise, if Ms. Oreo is with an elderly person and she says, I'm their guardian, and the elderly person clearly has some sort of impairment, dementia, that sort of things. Ms. Oreo cares about this elderly person. She's with that elderly person. Again, you can in good faith assume that it's reasonable that she is the guardian of these elderly people. The other circumstances, I do a lot of work with the Down Syndrome Association, is if there's a person with Down syndrome with Captain Cross, and Captain Cross says, this is my brother, uncle, son, and I am his guardian, you can reasonably assume by the interaction between the two that Captain Cross is his guardian, and you can count on that. So that's guardianship. Guardianship cannot be waived. The guardian can make the decisions for the individual that you're treating. Power of attorney, legally, again, you're subject to the good faith standard. So if you show up and I'm unconscious, and my wife comes from the same house and says, I have power of attorney, I'm a lawyer, I'm likely to have had a power of attorney, written for myself, all those facts seem to make sense, you can rely on that. So it's the same standard. In a do not resuscitate situation, in that situation, you want to be a little bit more clear on the do not resuscitate and always err toward resuscitation. The questions that come up, there was recently a case on this, somebody that had tattooed on them, do not resuscitate. You cannot rely on that tattoo because the person can change their mind. So on do not resuscitate, if I were a paramedic or an EMS person, I would push that to the next line of provider where there's more time to evaluate and to make that decision rather than doing it on the scene in an emergency. So any questions on those three? Power of attorney, guardianship, or do not resuscitate? All right, well, I'm going to end with some bloopers. And these are kind of fun, and maybe you've seen some of these before. Patient refused autopsy. All these came out of medical reports. So patient refused autopsy. I see some in the crowd snickering. Case in North Carolina, paramedics put somebody in a body bag, take him to the morgue. They lay him out in the morgue. His leg twitched and his eye twitched. The person was alive. So it does happen. The moral to that story is make sure they're really dead if you're going to declare them dead. But patient refused autopsy. Discharge status, alive without permission. Bleeding began in the rectal area and continued all the way to Los Angeles. That's one of my favorites, particularly if it's a North Carolina case. Patient has two teenage children, but no other abnormalities. So I thought that was kind of funny. It does point out the accuracy of your documentation. Make sure you spend time doing it right. A few extra minutes can make the difference when you're in the witness stand, particularly down the road in time. Right, Officer Wilson? Nodding his head. And I always like this one, no job is complete until the paperwork is done. And yes, sir.
Can you speak just briefly on how school officials play a role as guardians for students who are in school where their parents can't be found, or likewise, say, a church youth group? How does guardianship or how does that work legally?
Right. So legally, any supervising adult in a group activity, they are not a guardian, but they can direct decision-making for minors under their care. So this is an area where you will want to use cautious judgment. So you have a compound fracture of an arm, and the camp counselor says, this Bobby's under my supervision, and my opinion is he doesn't need further care. Obviously, that's incorrect. Your judgment supersedes that. However, as far as approving treatment, approving transport to the hospital, if ever, again, you need to use your best judgment under the facts that are presented to you. And under the law, if you have good cause to believe that that authority is consistent and accurate, you can then follow that authority. So you aren't going to want that person to make the life and death decisions. However, camp counselor, can I ride with Bobby in the ambulance to go as the supervisor? Absolutely. But a counselor, a school official, they are not a guardian, and they do not have any implied power of attorney, so they cannot make those critical decisions. The decisions are the best judgment for you. And if you need backup or reinforcement, you may need to do that. So uh, the example would be is you take some kids on a camping trip and you're with a religion that doesn't approve of medical treatment. And somebody falls and has a traumatic injury and you're called to the scene. You should provide relief from that traumatic injury and let that determination be made further down the line, not by the camp counselor or Boy Scout guide or teacher or supervisor who's with them.